My background is in petroleum geology. I'm a licensed professional geologist in the state of Wyoming, only because Colorado does not yet have licensing for professional geologists yet. Maybe someday, but not yet. So I'm licensed in Wyoming. I've been in the petroleum industry for about 20 years. All of that has been for companies based here in Colorado, mostly in the Denver area. But I've done work around the world, and some highlights of my career that I've really enjoyed. I got to drill a well in Australia to the west of Melbourne. I also drilled a well in China in the province of Inner Mongolia, which is the northern province bordering the country of Mongolia. And that was some beautiful country. So great experiences that I've had. I've been with the city of Aurora since 2020. I like to say I started 2 weeks before COVID hit. And so it's been a very unique experience at the city, but I've really enjoyed it. I'd be able to use my experience every day there in oil and gas, but I also get to learn something new about local government every day, which is awesome. I enjoy learning. We started out as the oil and gas division, doing all the oil and gas permitting and compliance inspections. About 2 years ago, we got some additional responsibilities in an environmental side, and we added those to our division as well. And a little fun personal fact, I am an award-winning author. In 2017, my wife and I adopted 4 kids from Peru. And I wrote a book about that experience to kind of chronicle the journey and really to encourage everyone to pursue the big dreams in life and the things that God may have for you. So if you want to talk about that, I'll be around afterwards. All right, so tonight we're going to talk about a couple of things. Plugged wells. What are they? Why are they important? Why would you need to locate a plugged well? Some problems with using data from the Energy and Carbon Management Commission. And while we're here, the ECMC is what used to be the Colorado Oil and Gas Conservation Commission, COGCC. It was that for decades. Now it's ECMC because they got new authority from the state legislature 2 years ago as well. So Energy and Carbon Management Commission, they do oil and gas, they do geothermal, deep geothermal, and carbon sequestration is going to be up and coming in the future. So ECMC. Some methods for finding plugged wells. I'm going to give you a successful search example, and I'm going to give you some resources, and we'll have time for a question and answer. All right, so you're all surveyors. I'm not. Tell me, what are some things that are important to surveying? Just shout them out. I like it. Yeah. Accuracy. Yep. Anybody? Who else? Great. Excellent. Love that. Yeah, absolutely. So 2 things when I think about looking for plugged wells specifically, 2 things I think are important are accuracy and precision. Now, I got this concept when I was in college in chemistry and realizing that there's different ways that you can have your data, right? You can be accurate but not precise. You can be precise but not accurate. You could be neither. But of course, the goal is to be both accurate and precise. And that's probably the core of what you do as surveyors, right? I mean, your work has to be top notch. It has to be both accurate and precise. And we're going to use that concept here tonight. So if I gave you a 160-acre target, a quarter section, and I said somewhere in this quarter section, there is a 10-inch diameter vertical pipe buried underground, and I want you to go find it and locate it and survey it. If I was doing that job, I would feel a bit uncomfortable with that. I would feel like that was a little bit of a challenge. But I like challenges, and that's okay. So that's the what if. What if you had to do that? So we're going to kind of work through this tonight. So we're going to start with plugged wells. What is a plugged well? A plugged well means the condition of a well after it's finished its useful life. Okay, so it's drilled. Either it found hydrocarbons and it produced for a long time, and then the production ended, and so they plugged it, or they drilled it, they did not ever produce it, it wasn't commercial, and so they plugged it right away. We'll talk about the differences in those in just a minute. Cement is placed inside portions of the steel pipe, the casing, underground. It's not fully full of cement when they plug it, but they put plugs in, bridge plugs, put the cement on top of that to isolate certain areas. And then that pipe is cut off about 5 feet below the surface. Here's a picture from a well that was plugged in Aurora many years ago. It was dug up and located and replugged and a couple of years ago. And you can see that once the surface equipment's all removed, there's not much left. Okay, this isn't even a 10-inch casing. This is probably 6 or 8-inch. There's not much left there under the ground. And once the surface is properly remediated, there can be no evidence at all that anything was ever there. But yet this well is under the ground, and that pipe goes down maybe 8,000 feet below the surface. Okay, so there's a mile and a half of pipe below that point right there, but you can't see it once it's plugged and abandoned. All right, so when we think about the whole state, we've got 51,500 plugged wells in the state of Colorado. This is a map from the ECMC website. All the red dots here are individual wells. You can see most of those are up in Weld County. A lot of those are some over in Grand Junction, the Piceance Basin, and the basins along the state line to the south. So, but a pretty good spread. There's, most areas have at least a few wells. The state classifies their plugged wells with two different codes. The first is P&A. That stands for plugged and abandoned. P&A means that the well did produce during its lifetime. So it was drilled, it was completed, and then it produced hydrocarbons, either oil or gas or both, during its life, but now it's plugged. That's important to know because that's going to tell you something about the history of the well. So if it's P&A, you would expect that there probably were some tanks on the surface. There might be a flow line buried under the surface, connecting that well to those tanks or to something else in the field. It's going to give you some information about the history of what happened at that site. The second code is DNA, which stands for dry and abandoned. This means that the well was drilled and they did not find enough, they didn't find any hydrocarbons, or they didn't find enough to make it commercially available. And that is an important distinction because even in a dry well, it doesn't mean that there wasn't oil or gas there found. It just means that it wasn't deemed to be commercially successful if they would produce it. 50 years ago, the price of natural gas was $1 an MCF and less. It was not very valuable. If there was no pipeline to connect, maybe you were looking for oil, but you found gas instead. There was no pipeline to get that gas out. They just plugged the well. So there could still be hydrocarbons there in those zones that were targeted, but they just never were produced. Okay, so that's an important distinction. In addition to those 50,000, we have another 47,500 wells that are actively open. Many of those are producing. Some of those are shut in, which means they could produce, but they're not producing today or this month, but they could produce, right? So you add those numbers together, someday we're going to have 100,000 plugged wells in the state of Colorado. And every one of those is a point in the ground. It's a point on a map, and it may be one that we have to find in the future, either to replug it or when development begins to move through the area and you start to get some conflicts between these features. This is a zoom in on the city of Aurora. The yellow is the city limits, and the black dots are the plugged wells. And you can see that as you move up to the north, up here to the top is a Denver International Airport. As you get closer to the airport, there's a lot more plugged wells there, and even over here to the northeast. So we've got 64. We had 61 this time last year, but we annexed a square mile, and we got 3 new plugged wells. So we've got 64. And these are important to us. We keep very close track of these because we've got development occurring around quite a few of them. We'll talk about that a little bit later as well. For context, the surrounding counties, Arapahoe County has almost 1,000 plugged wells. Adams County has 3,000. Weld County has over 18,000. Okay, so you can see that it does vary based on your geography. Even where we are here tonight, which is right down here in the blue star, just 2.5 miles northwest, there's a plugged well right over there, right close to the golf course. Or at least that's where the state says it is. I can't tell you where it is exactly, but we'll talk about that as well. But anyway, I just wanted to point out that these are not just in rural areas, right? They are in urban areas as well. Looking at the chart here for the whole state, the ECMC and its predecessor was founded in 1951 by the legislature. And since 1951, the state has been plugging, not the state itself, but in the state, we've been plugging about 500 wells per year, right? So that's what we've been doing up until the last decade, and the number's gone up significantly. So we've plugged a lot more wells in the last decade than we were on the average in the years before that. I'd also note that even before the ECMC began, we've got a record of over 500 plugged wells in the state. The industry in Colorado began in the 1880s. So oil and gas production began in the 1880s in Colorado. And so that was well before, it was 70 years before the ECMC or COGCC was formed. So there's a lot of wells that were drilled here historically, and of course, all of those are plugged. There are some risks for plugged wells. In the early industry, plugging a well was thought to be the end of the story. The operator came, they drilled, either they didn't find oil, they plugged it right away, they did, they produced, and then they plugged it. But once they plugged it, the rights of the operator kind of go away, the land goes back to the surface owner, and it was deemed to be, this is the end of the story. We're done, nothing more to do. However, a couple things have changed. One of those is that the state rules have changed over time. They've become much more stringent, and what's required now to successfully or adequately plug a well is much more robust than what was required, 50 years ago or even 25 years ago. The other thing is that we know that cement and steel casing deteriorate over time. There's a number of factors that affect that. Remember, this is steel, buried in the ground. You've got the salinity of the fluids, you've got fresh water at the top, you've got salt water at the bottom, you've got different salinities of water that's affecting that steel casing, stresses on the well bore after it was plugged, the depth and temperature of the well, and the type of cement used in the original plug. So all those things are working, over time to deteriorate the steel casing and the cement. Now, in some cases, they can be robust. They can last for a long time. We've plugged a well that was We've replugged a well that was originally drilled 100 years ago. The steel casing was still there, but is not. There's some holes in it, right? So they had to do some remediation in order to do the successful plugging. This is a graphic, and I know it's kind of hard to see, but it really just is meant to indicate how there are successive sizes of pipe that are put into the ground, and then there's cement in between those. Okay, so you're going to drill your hole in the ground, and then they're going to put pipe inside the hole. They're going to pump cement down the pipe and back up the outside. So now you've got cement between the pipe and the rock. And then they're going to come back inside that pipe and drill deeper. So they're going to do the first one through the aquifer zones, the shallow aquifers, and then they're going to do more drilling through that pipe. So you got a big pipe to start, you got a smaller one to drill second. You're going to drill down through, and then you do the same process. You cement that in place. So however many strings of casing you have, you've got the casing and you've got cement that's isolating that from everything else. Okay, but all of these can deteriorate. When we think about the risk for plugged wells, again, we've got the two different categories. For P&A wells that did produce, the biggest risk that we see is the slow leaking of hydrocarbons up to the surface through that well. So the cement inside the casing will crack over time, and then hydrocarbons that are in the well down lower, they start to kind of percolate up through to the surface. And the slow leak is what we typically see. I do have a slide on a blowout here in a few minutes, but typically we see a slow leak. So you do a soil check over the P&A well, you see an elevation of methane or an elevation of hydrocarbons in that soil. For DNA wells, it's the downhole communication between the hydrocarbon zones and the freshwater aquifers. And that's because on a dry well, they would typically put in that casing for the surface, and then they test it down below when they drill it, but if they're not going to produce it, they don't put pipe down to the bottom of the hole. So what you end up with is a hole in the ground that's essentially 8,000 feet deep, maybe 10 inches in diameter, and you've got drilling mud there or dirt or something else that they put into that hole, but the hydrocarbons can access that from the formations, and they can go up and they even contaminate the freshwater aquifers. I'll show you a slide on that in just a minute. The final risk is future construction risk, and we've seen this in Aurora. We had a developer that came in. We told them they had 2 plugged wells on the property. We told them they need to locate them, assess them. They didn't do that. They took a grader route. They hit both of the plugged wells on their property. Fortunately, there were no incidents from that, which was lucky, I think, because if you were to have a leak or you have some type of a fracture in the well, you've got hydrocarbons there, you hit metal with metal, you get a spark, you could have an explosion. We don't want that. So we are working hard to make sure the developers know what plug wells they have on their properties and what to do about them. All right, so here's an example of from Aurora of the changes in plugging rules over time and how you can have some of this contamination. So what you see on the screen there, you can see the ground surface at the top. The yellow or tan is the well bore, the hole in the ground. And then you can see you've got some cement and pipe down to 163 feet. Now, this well was drilled in 1958. They didn't require, even back then, that all of the aquifers were isolated from the production zones. So only 163 feet. Now, the aquifers in this well, there's 4 aquifers, and they go down to 1,800 feet. Okay, so all of this interval down below is what we call open hole. Okay, so there's no pipe in it, there's no cement in it. Today, since 1958, it's just drilling mud and whatever else they wanted to put in there. Okay, the only cement was up here at the top in the first 163 feet. So 2023, our operator Civitas came back in. They replugged this. You can see the additional cement that they put into the inside the casing there. It isolates, it covers the freshwater aquifers. It isolates the lower production zone down here. And we're able to have a well that's properly plugged, up to modern standards. So, a couple situations we're trying to avoid. One of those situations is right where that yellow star is a plugged well. Now, you can imagine if you ever have to get in and replug this well, or if it leaks, it's going to be a problem. It's well nigh impossible to get a rig in between those homes there. There are some options that are available, but it could be very, very difficult. Certainly would be disruptive to the community if we had to do this. Because here's what it looks like. Okay, here's a picture from a well that's being replugged because it was leaking right near a house in Meade, Colorado. This is 2015, so a little less than 10 years ago. You've got a rig set up just a couple feet from a house. That's not a positive situation for anybody. Nobody wants to see that. The homeowner doesn't want to see it. The community doesn't want to see it. The local government doesn't want to see it. So we're trying to avoid that. And then this other situation, this was from Johnstown last December. This is the blowout that happened from a plugged well. I've had some in the industry tell me that, it wasn't ever properly plugged. That's not true. You can look up the state records yourself. I've looked them up. It was properly plugged, okay, a couple decades ago. And the plug failed, and based on some offsetting activity, it blew out, and it created this giant geyser of water and chemicals that sprayed all over the field there. Fortunately, it was a field and not homes, right? So the state came in and plugged it. That's great. But again, we want to try to avoid this situation. That's what we're trying to do in Aurora. We work with the development community. We're working on creating an easement process. Most of the jurisdictions already have this. Adams County, Arapahoe County, Weld County, most of in the cities, Boulder, Broomfield, they have easements already in place. We're working on that. That's not my subject tonight, but we're working on that process to get that through this into city code. And when we have a developer that comes in, there's a lot of things they can do with that. There's a plugged well right there. Okay, you're walking by, you can't see it, you don't know it's there, but if we ever have to get in there and replug it, we can get access to it, or the state can get access to it, because there's a park, and we can do it with minimal disruption to the community. We've actually worked on a number of different options with developers. I know it's kind of hard to see, there's a lot of small pictures here, but that same park is in the top left up there, HOA Park. We've approved a detention pond, a stormwater detention pond to be placed over a plugged well. The next one is Aurora Highlands. That's going to be open space over a plugged well. We've got a couple examples here. The big white box, which I know is hard to see from the screen here, that's a industrial warehouse. They've got a plugged well in their parking lot. Same thing with the Denali Logistics there on the bottom. And, of course, the Gaylord has some plugged wells in their parking lots also. So we've been working with the community, and it's very possible. Okay, it's not that difficult to plan development around plugged wells and leave space to be able to access them in the future, but it does take planning and it does take work together. All right, so that's our deep dive on plugged wells themselves, what they are. Let's talk about reasons to locate a plugged well. Why might you need to locate that, or why might somebody need to locate a plugged well? Some of the things we've talked about already. Perhaps it's leaking, it needs to be repaired. You want to reduce risk. Some developers will choose to, even if the well's not leaking, they'll choose to replug it now while they're doing their development so that they lower their risk, of having to replug it 2 years from now, 5 years from now, and they try to protect their investment and their development that way. The ECMC rules also require operators to replug certain wells within 1,500 feet of a new horizontal well. So an operator comes in, they want to drill a new horizontal well. There's an existing or a plugged well close to that new well. They have to access it and evaluate it and determine if it should be replugged up to modern standards. And we've had 15 wells, I think, replugged in Aurora, primarily in that situation in the last couple of years. And then finally, maybe even if the well's not leaking, you just need to determine an accurate location prior to nearby development so you can put it on a site plan, right? We're requiring that in Aurora, that the wells get put on a site plan. That's what happened with that example I gave you earlier with the two houses. That subdivision was put in well before our division came into the picture with the city. And they are actually on the site plan. That well is on the site plan. But nobody at that time said, hey, you shouldn't put a house so close to this well. All right. So now let's get to the core of what we're talking about. Locating plugged wells. So the developer comes to you. They say, hey, we've got some plugged wells on our property. We would like you to locate them. We'd like you to survey them so we can put them on a site plan. We can see exactly where they are. Your first thought is, hey, I'm going to go to the state database. I'm going to go to ECMC. That's who maintains all the data on all the wells. I'm going to go right there. I'm going to see what their map shows. And away we go. All right, well, let's look at that. So here's an example from a section in Aurora. This is Township 3 South, 66 West, Section 35. And when you look at the record, the ECMC database, there's a well that shows up right there in the middle of the section. Okay, and you can get some information about that well. It's the Jameson number 1. It's P&A, which means it produced in its history, right? You've got a very detailed latitude longitude there, right? You've got a 6 decimal latitude longitude. You're thinking, hey, this is great. Somebody's located this well. They know exactly where it is. This is going to be perfect. And then you notice that the well was drilled in 1918. And you think, well, there wasn't any GPS around in 1918. How did they get a latitude longitude so precisely for this well? Okay, good question. And here's the key point. If you get nothing else from tonight, get this about the ECMC data. To try to give people as much information as they can, they take every well that they have any information about and they put it on their map somewhere. Okay, so if the most detailed information they have is the section, it's section 35, they're going to spot it on their map right in the center of the section 35. If it's a quarter section, they're going to spot it right in the middle of the section of the quarter section. Okay, so when you look at the data, yeah, it's very precise. You've got a 6 decimal latitude longitude, but it may not be accurate when you get to the field. Okay, that's a very key thing you need to know about the data. So here's a couple of examples. This is a drilling permit from 1955. You can see in the bottom, they do have quarter section on here. They've located it on the map there, which is helpful. But this is a little bit unusual. A lot of them didn't have quarter sections. A lot of times it had to do with the size of the lease. If the operator leased a whole square mile, for example, from the mineral owner, they may have just referenced the square mile at the section as their drilling permit. In this case, maybe they only had a 40-acre lease, so they had to kind of make it more specific. The leases are a good bit of historical information that can also help you find out where some of these wells are. We move up. This one is in the 1970s. You've got do you have a footage call, 660 from the north line, 660 from the east line? But I would say that in this time, 50 years ago, even though you have footage references here, it doesn't mean that that's exactly where the well was drilled. Okay, a lot of times a driller goes out to the field, and remember, in the old days, particularly if they were in an exploration situation where they didn't know if they were going to find oil and gas, they would go out and the driller might say, hey, I don't like this spot right here where the stake is. It's flatter over there. And I'm not going to build a big pad. I just want to get out here and get the job done. It's flatter over there. That's further away from the stream, or that's closer to the road, right? So I'm going to put the well right there. As long as they're on the same lease, generally it was good. And at that time, they really weren't even required to report changes in the location. So they do that now. That's required. But back at this time, they didn't. And then, of course, this is a modern example from 2023 where you've got actual GPS data and actual quality data, from the GPS that kind of associate, how good is this data that's being presented. All right, so this is my chart. Like I said, it's going to be in your slides when they get sent out. This is something that I've developed for us in Aurora as we're doing searches. It's based on how long ago the well was drilled. The spud date means the date that they dropped the bit on the ground and they started turning it, they started actually drilling the well. That's the spud date. For wells that were drilled before 1951, that's before ECMC and COGCC were formed, it's really 160 acre. It's a quarter section search radius that you might find that. And I'll give you an example here just a minute that demonstrates that. That could be, thousands of feet, 2,000 feet, 1,800 feet from the center. If the well on the ECMC site says that it's in the middle of the section, but it's actually down in the corner, that could be 1,800 feet away. It's a long way. Okay, now when you get from the 51 to the 70s, we drop that down to about a 40 acre, a quarter, right? Still a lot of distance, right? A lot of area to have to search. From the 70s to 2005, we say about 10 acre spacing, which is still several hundred feet. And then December of 2005, the ECMC began receiving GPS data, and we've got much more accurate data from then. And at that point, for wells that were drilled in the past 20 years, you're probably looking at tens of feet. Okay, you probably still aren't going to know exactly where that well is in the ground, but you might be looking at tens of feet to have to search. So it's a much smaller search window. So here's a method that I've developed that I go through if I have to try to find a plugged well, or if I have to advise a developer on how they should go about finding a plugged well. The first thing is do everything from your desk, from your office, from your laptop that you possibly can. Look at every map, look at every document, look at every aerial photograph, anything you can find. And I'm going to give you some sources that I use here at the end. Anything you can find is going to be helpful. It's going to save you time and resources when you go out to the field. Okay, you want to look at all the ECMC records, and sometimes for old wells, there will be correspondence in those records where the operator sent a letter to the state commission where they might have said, we decided to move this well over a little bit, or we decided to skid it 100 feet or something. Those types of things are clues, pieces to the puzzle that you can use to help find the wells. Leases, surface owner records, other county records. Again, anything you can find on paper or digitally, those are very, very important to start with. From that, you want to establish the most likely location of the well and a search polygon. Even if it's 160 acres, whatever it is, establish that search polygon that you think you're going to need to search. From there, you can use a magnetometer, either a ground-based or an aerial unit. There's companies using drones now with magnetometers, which is really helpful in areas that have, if they're overgrown or they have topography that's not easy to traverse by walking, or if it's a very large area, the drones can be very cost-effective there. They can also help find abandoned flow lines. I'll show you that here in a minute as well. And then once you've done all of this, then you go out and do physical searching. Okay, you bring your backhoe out or some other equipment, and you actually dig in the ground and look for the well. That's the last thing you want to do, because you want to minimize how big of a hole you have to dig when you have equipment on the ground. All right, so taking all those things in mind, I'm going to give you an example that we did in Aurora, real example, and how we use all the data and it helped us find a well that we couldn't find otherwise. So. In all of these examples, this is section 28. The northeast quarter is in the red polygon here. This well is the Iman number 1. It was spud in 1919. That's when it began drilling. It was permitted in the northeast quarter. So, of course, therefore, the ECMC database says it's right in the center. That's where they spotted it. That's the lat long that they give you. We had a developer that came into the city and said, hey, we want to do some industrial warehouses out in this quarter section. We own it. We're putting together a plan. What do we need to do? We said, well, you've got a well. You need to find it. Here's some options for how to do that. And it's probably not where it says that it is. So just so you know, it's 100 years ago. Okay? All right. So unfortunately, the developer did not take our advice. And the first thing they did was bring a backhoe out and start digging around for the well. Okay? So they started out right here in the center of the quarter section. They brought a backhoe back. They dug a whole big hole. They dug down to 20 feet deep, very large hole. Couldn't find anything. I said, okay, well, that was odd. Not from my perspective, but they thought it was. And so then they brought a magnetometer out, and they searched right around the area there where the the lat long said their wells was. Didn't find it there. They searched another area that they thought it might be in, and they couldn't find it anywhere. So they came back to the city. They said, we don't think this well exists. It was 100 years ago. Maybe it's deteriorated, never drilled. Who knows? So we're just going to proceed with our development. And who cares about this well? I said, well, no, actually, we're not going to do it that way. Let's look at it the right way and let's see what we can find. All right. So I got involved. I started looking at the data. First thing I noticed was the topo map. The topo map shows a hill or high, surface high there in the green, which is kind of more toward the center of the section and then overlapping into the northeast quarter. And I happen to know, being a petroleum geologist, that 100 years ago, a lot of times drillers were looking for surface features like hills because they often mimic the subsurface structure. So they were looking for like a dome under the ground that would accumulate and trap the oil or gas. And so they would look for a hill on the surface that might be reflective of that, because they weren't drilling very deep. They were drilling, a couple thousand feet back then. And so they were looking for surface high. That's why a lot of oil wells, old wells, are drilled on hills, because they were looking for a dome structure under the ground that would trap the oil and gas. Okay? So when I look at that, I say, well, if I was going to be planning a well 100 years ago, I would probably put it more toward the middle of section 28, not the middle of the quarter section. It's one piece of the puzzle, that's all. All right, so then we looked at some aerial photographs, and we looked at all the aerial photographs that we could find. And we found, I know, again, it's really hard to see on this screen, but where the red arrows are, there's two little depressions that collect water. And various aerial photographs in different years would show water, like little ponds there. So I'm looking at that and saying, well, why would you have a pond on the top of a hill, right? Nature doesn't do that. Nature puts ponds down in the low space where water flows, it collects, right? So if there's a pond or a pit on top of a hill, it's probably man-made, right? Two more pieces of the puzzle. All right, then I got lucky. Went to the Adams County records. I know, again, this is hard to read. We found a lien from a Mr. Thomas Luther in 1919 against the Eman Oil Corporation. And when you read through all the lien documents, it turns out Mr. Luther was a roustabout. He was actually working on drilling this well in this section. He got paid for a couple months and then ran out of money, so he kept working, and he had a couple months where he wasn't being paid. So he put a lien on the property, on the rig, on the well, everything that was there. And in this lien, now obviously this has nothing to do with oil and gas specifically. It's not a lease. It's not a drilling permit. It's none of that, but it is a piece of the puzzle. And in this lien, he describes the section, northeast quarter, section 28, and then he describes the location of the drilling rig. It says a Parkerberg standard drilling rig situated about 250 feet northeasterly from the center of the section 28 and used for drilling the well. Okay, another piece of the puzzle. So I put all this together. We've got the hill. We've got 250 feet northeast of the center of the section there. We've got some surface features. We've got the areas that the developer did a magnetometer survey and didn't find anything. We put all this together, and I created two search polygons. And I told the developer, if you'll go back out and do a magnetometer survey on these two search polygons, and if you don't find anything there, we'll call it good. And we'll agree that the well can't be found. Well, guess what? They had Civitas come and do a magnetometer survey, actually over the entire, most of the quarter section, and they found the well right in search polygon number 1. That well's now been re-entered. It's now been replugged. And fortunately, in this case, it didn't conflict with the development that they had planned. It's close enough to the section or the quarter section line that's a parking lot. So in this case, it was fortunate. It did not conflict with the developer's plans, and it worked out well for them. But the point is, this well is 1,452 feet from where ECMC said it was on their map. Now, they changed it now because we filed a new location. 1,452 feet. That's a long way. It's about 450 feet from the center of the section. So Mr. Luther, 100 years ago, eyeballing it, was closer than the ECMC was today in modern times, which I just find it's kind of humorous. All right, so I mentioned finding the flow lines as well. This is, again, as some results of a magnetometer survey. The little location at the bottom The dry hole symbol, that's where the ECMC said that the well was. The actual well was found about 100 feet, 108 feet northwest. And then the yellow dotted lines, those are inferred of where we think there's flow lines associated with this well. And flow lines have become a really important topic in Colorado after the accident in Firestone and the deaths that occurred there in 2018. Very, very important. And now ECMC has a new layer on their database where operators are required to submit their flow lines, okay, for their wells. But that doesn't account for all the 50,000 wells that are already plugged, okay? And half of those produced. Half of those probably had flow lines, 25,000 of them in the state. We don't know where those flow lines are. They probably start at the wellhead and they go somewhere. Who knows how far? We don't know. Typical depth, 5 feet. Flow lines, yeah. Yeah, flow lines are just very below plow depth. All right, so in summary, thank you for your attention. I really appreciate you as an audience. This is really amazing. Eventually, there's going to be 100,000, more than 100,000 plugged wells in Colorado. Knowing the accurate and precise location of each of those is becoming more important as development begins to move out of current urban areas and begins to move through areas that may have had wells drilled in the past. Many wells are expected to be replugged in the future. Again, I have some in the industry that push back and say that's not true. All the wells aren't going to need to be replugged. And I agree with that. We're not going to replug every single well, but many of them will. And the fact is, we just don't know what's going to happen with the steel and cement as the decades go by, right? I'm work for the city. The city's going to be here forever. I'm not looking for what's going to happen next year or even 10 years or even 50 years from now. But I'm concerned about beyond that, right? What are these wells going to look like then? And will we have to have access to them in the future to plug them again? Keep in mind, big takeaway, the older the well, the harder it's going to be to find, and the larger your search radius is probably going to need to be. But keep things in order when you do your search. Do everything you can from your office. Use the internet. Go to the county records if you have to. Do everything you can on paper and digital first. Then you can go out to the field and do your work there. Some jurisdictions have easements now. I mentioned that already. Aurora's working on that. We're looking at putting a 200-foot by 200-foot square around plugged wells as an easement. So it's basically 100 feet, around the well radius. And that's going to allow space that we would need in the future to bring in the equipment that's necessary to do the replugging if needed. So some resources that I've used. Does anybody here know about CAPS, Colorado Aerial Photo Service? Does anybody use that in Denver? That's okay. If you haven't been here, you should just call John and go check it out. This is the biggest data mine of aerial photographs for the larger Denver metro area that nobody knows about. It is incredible. John himself flew flights and took aerial photos for decades. His predecessor started back in the 30s. They've got just millions of aerial photographs, specifically from the Denver metro area, that have been taken, for 60, 80 years almost. A lot of them are hard copy, some are microfilm, some have been digitized. He's got all the bells and whistles. He can take a photo, he can digitize it, he can georectify it, he can give you a 3D printout with a stereoscopic viewer or 3D glasses. He can give it to you in any format that you want. And he's not paying me to say this. I just am so impressed with his data and what's there. If you don't know about it and you ever need aerial photographs, it's a huge resource. One of the reasons is I've got Google Earth mentioned here on the bottom. I use Google Earth all the time, for drawing quick maps and things like that. And I have some of my data there. And it's a great resource. But you get back, before the 2000s, you get into the 90s and the 80s, and a lot of the data is pretty grainy, right? It's not very high it's very low resolution. That's because it's from satellites. The aerial photos, they're really good resolution, right? Because they were flown at, probably 10,000 feet or less of elevation above the ground. I also subscribe to a service called Historic Aerials. You can get some free data there, but they do have a subscription-based service. The benefit there is you can log in or zoom into a lat long or a city or an address, whatever you're looking for. It'll show you the street map, and then they've got all the topos georectified right there, all the aerial photographs that they have loaded. They're loading new ones all the time, and you can just click on the date that you want and go and see what they have. And it just pops right up. It's all georectified, and it's a lot easier than the old days when you had to search on the USGS site like for a topo map. So it's a good resource. And then, of course, Google Earth, USGS, county websites, those are all really important. And then finally, I've got a couple of companies listed on here that do magnetometer surveys. If you need a company to partner with, this is in no way an endorsement of any of these companies. These are just literally names of companies that have been submitted on some of those magnetometer surveys that we've received in the city. We haven't worked directly with any of these companies, so I can't vouch for them, or tell you they're good or bad, but they are here locally. They do work in the Denver area. Some of them extend out to Colorado and other areas also. So you'll have that. And I believe that is the end of my slides and presentation. And if there's time, I'll happy to take questions.
There is a question online that
1919, a lot of these older ones, because I know that's like a national concern as far as how much like methane and like gases they emit. Are they necessarily like all plugged? It's just
Great question, Haley. For those of you online, I don't know if you can hear her or not, but asking about wells that may be orphaned, which means they don't have an operator anymore. Operator's gone bankrupt. That's an important topic, and there are wells that still have the equipment on the surface because the operator's gone bankrupt and they didn't fulfill their obligation to plug the well. That's legally required, but they ran out of money and left the state, generally speaking. They're not here anymore. Or sometimes they just change names of the company, change the name on the door. They're now a new company, and they no longer have any responsibility for. They don't think they have any responsibility for their old wells. It is a problem. Right now, what happens is if a company goes bankrupt, their wells go onto what's called the orphan well list. Orphan meaning that there's no legal entity that will fund the plugging of those wells. So the state takes them over. ECMC takes them over. Last I heard, we had about 700, I think, wells across the state, but I believe that's grown because we've had some new companies that have gone bankrupt, just this year. There's one in the news just this week, Prospect Energy, that's having their operatorship license removed by ECMC because they won't follow the rules, they won't plug wells, they won't clean up spills. So ECMC is actually removing their ability to operate in the state. Their 60 wells are going to go on the orphan well list. The state has funds that come from the operators that help pay for some of that plugging. There's also been some federal funds in the infrastructure bill that came out 2 years ago. The state got $25 million, and I think they are eligible for another $50 million to get to plug these wells. The state plugs about one a week, so about 50 wells a year. I've been pushing for them to do more than that. I think last year, they may have done like 80, so they're getting up to almost 2 a week. This is good. This is a big improvement, 100% improvement. But the fact is, there is a lot of these wells. And when the operators has walked away, no one knows what the condition is. They could be leaking oil or methane. They could be open. The valve could be open. They could be, venting methane gas to the air. No one knows until the state goes out and does a check. The state will eventually get around to checking those and doing some analysis. They have a complex flow chart that they use to decide which well to plug next. That's all has to do with how close the well is to homes or schools, whether or not it is actively leaking or whether or not it's sealed, things like that. In Aurora, we've had 2 such wells. One was by a company called PetroShare. It was plugged by the state 2 years ago, but they still haven't remediated the surface. So they plugged the well under the ground, but the tanks are still on the surface, and they haven't reclaimed it and revegetated it. We've got one more well that was a Painted Pegasus Petroleum well, and that's on the state orphan well list, but it's out very far in a rural area, and we don't know when it's going to get replugged. Someday. To answer your question? Okay. Yeah.
Jeff, we've got a question online. Is there a standard depth a well is plugged?
Do you mean how deep does the cement go, or how much is it cut off below the ground surface? I'll answer both since I can't interact that way.
Yeah.
Once the well is properly plugged, they generally cut off the pipe and they backfill it to about 5 feet in depth. Primarily, that's like plow depth. They're trying to get it below plow depth for agricultural areas. That's really the primary consideration. They just don't want to hit it with equipment in the future. But in terms of putting cement inside the pipe, again, it doesn't go all the way down to the bottom of the pipe. Okay, they're going to go somewhere in between the productive interval, which is usually at the bottom, and then the aquifers, wherever that is. So somewhere in there, they're going to put a bridge plug, which is a device they can insert into the pipe, expand to seal off the well below, and then they're going to put cement on top of that. Okay, they'll do that again up at the surface and put another cement plug at the surface. But the whole entire pipe is not full of cement.
Okay. And then another question, what happens to above ground dry hole markers? Sorry, did I lose you?
The question online is what kind of marking is required on these wells? And reality is there is nothing required. I'm going to go back here so I can go quicker. There is a plate that's required to be welded on the top of the actual pipe itself. Let me go back to this slide here. And if you can see right down here on the top of the pipe, there's a little plate where they've welded on the name of the well, the location, and the API number, which is the reference for ECMC. But that's buried. So generally speaking, there's nothing. Yeah. Yeah. Right. Those are all great questions. I believe that, not to toot our own horn, but I believe that Aurora is more at the forefront, dealing with these plugged wells in regards to new development, because we understand the risk and we understand that there does need to be some separation between the plugged wells and future development, particularly structures, right? I mean, you can put some things over the top of them, but we don't want a house or any kind of building, built over the top of the well. So we are really kind of trying to drive that interest, which is part of the reason they're coming here, to drive interest for other jurisdictions to see the value and the need to incorporate these things, and plan them for how development occurs around them. Because right now there isn't a lot. And until you dig down and actually find it 5 feet below the surface, you don't have that information. Now you can see that if you dig this up in the future, you'd be able to say, okay, well, yes, we know we found the right well because it's got the weld on the plate there with the name, so you could confirm it that way. But otherwise, for the older, that's only happened, I don't know when they started doing that. It wasn't all that long ago. Like, it's been decades, but not for the whole history of the state, right? So the majority of wells that are currently plugged don't have that label on them. Right. Yeah. Oh, yeah, absolutely. Because they go to the ECMC database, they look at a map, and the map shows a well. It says it's in the middle of the quarter section, and they're like, great, we know where it is. I mean, why wouldn't you, right? This is 2024. You look at a map, you expect it to be accurate. The reason that they do that and they put it on there is because the only alternative is to leave it off and put it on a list somewhere, right? Well, who's ever going to look at a list? Nobody's going to look at a list, right? So in order to try to get as much information out there to tell you there is a well somewhere nearby, they use the most detailed information they have, whatever that is, section, quarter, and they spot it right in the middle of that area. So at least you know it's nearby, but that's the critical part, is that people have to know it's nearby. It's not necessarily right there. Full lines. Mhm. Mo correct. Yep. Modern ones are. So ones that are currently active as flow lines in the state, those are required to be put to be submitted to the state in a GIS. And you can go on the ECMC website and look at a layer, a data layer that has the flow lines on it for currently producing wells, right? For the all current producing wells, yes. Yeah. For the ones that are metal, you can use a magnetometer. You know, and again, you can think about the fact that the flow lines did connect somewhere, right? So they generally connected to the wellhead to start, right? So if you know where the wellhead is, or you can figure that out, then the flow line is going to start near the wellhead, and then it's going to go somewhere. Uh, they they could have natural gas oil in them, yes. Well, if it's sealed inside the pipe, it'll never deteriorate. If the pipe is not sealed on the end, then it could eventually leak out. You know, the gas would, the oil could stay in there forever. So, but yeah, finding the flow lines is a big deal. Now, also, there are flow lines that are not metal. Okay. At one point in the industry, they used asbestos wrapped fiberglass for flow lines, which is lovely if you don't know that it's there and you take your grader out and grade over the location, and now you have asbestos over your whole development area. Not a pretty picture. Hasn't happened in Aurora, but I have heard about it happening, you know, in the country. So it makes you really want to look at the details before you buy a property. If you're going to develop it, look at the history and understand, you know, what's happened there to the best of your ability. Yes. There's none required. Not in our state. I mean, I have seen some, not in Aurora, but in other places. We've discussed it. Um, we've discussed it. There's pros and cons, you know, to requiring a marker. Um, the con, well, from the landowner perspective, right? See, so you have to understand that as a local jurisdiction, we don't have the authority to access private property, right? So I can't go out to, you know, John Smith's field and say, hey, you have to put a marker over your well here, you know, in your field that you're going to plow every year and plant crops. I can't dictate that, you know, at this point. Now, if we pass a law, you know, maybe we could do that. But I can't do that. I can't just go out and do it, right? I've got to communicate with the landowner, make them aware of the situation, and get their involvement in that. So, right, right. It's not really being done right now. Yeah. There's just the pipe under the ground. There's no surface marking, you know, that's put there. The state, generally speaking, if the state has signed off on a plugging and said, yes, we approve, it's good, then they're on the hook to do replugging if the well ever leaks. And I've also heard people say, oil and gas people say, well, you know, any modern plugging is good. You don't have to worry about it. It'll be good for 100 years. You know, it's just the old ones that you have to worry about. Not true. We know here in the metro area, I think in Erie, we were talking about Erie earlier, they've had wells that were plugged just like, you know, 4 years ago that leaked a couple of years later. You know, so that's definitely modern standards. The part there is that the state can sign off, but there needs to be inspection, right? The state has inspectors. We have our own inspector. We are working to get out to all the pluggings so that we know what's going on. We know the job and the work is done appropriately and correctly. Because the operator can file the form with the state, and they can give the details, how much cement they use, and so forth and so on. But there are uniqueness to doing the work, right? And it has to be done in the proper way. And if it's not, it may not hold. Uh, you mean, right. Yes. Yeah. Yes. It does. Yes. Yeah. Yeah, we're doing two things in Aurora. The first is we're maintaining our own database, right? So if we go out and find a well or somebody finds a well to replug it, we're taking our own GPS, measurement of that wellhead, checking it, double checking it with the value that the operator gets. Because when the operator, whoever operator it is, when they go out to replug the well, they have to take new measurements and they have to submit that to the ECMC, right? So eventually ECMC will get it updated in their database. We QC that as a city because it's important to us to have it right. But we also maintain our own database that's separate from the state, just so the state ever, I don't know, they lose their database, we don't lose ours. Yes, yeah. We don't have it posted right now or anything, but we could do that. We could certainly do that. No, I mean, you could core it if you wanted to, if you had a specific thing. Sure, yeah. No, I mean, frankly, just call me. I mean, if you're looking in Aurora, call me and say, hey, what do you know about this well or this property? We have developers that do that, pretty regularly. Yes. No, good question. We exempt anything that's already built. So anything where there's already been development and there's already buildings around a well, we have to exempt those. We can't go back and require buildings to be removed, or a home to be removed or something. We're not doing that. So really, it's at a point forward when we require the easement. It's whenever a developer comes in, and they're going to do a new development, they're going to locate the wells, and then they're going to put those in the site plan, and then the easement will eventually be noted on the site plan itself. That's generally going to overlap a parking lot, something like that, in most of the cases. So the concern from the development community, of course, is, well, are you taking an acre away? If you do 200 by 200, that's 40,000 square feet. It's almost an acre. Are you going to take that away from us in our development, right? So you're telling me I can't develop on this acre. Well, no, not quite, because in all those examples that I gave, those parks, those open spaces, even parking lots in some cases, those are all a required part of the development. Like you can't build a warehouse without a parking lot, right? You got to have a parking lot around it. So if you just put the parking lot over the plugged well, you lose 0 acres, right? You put your required park over the plugged well, you put your required open space over the plugged well, it overlaps with the easement, you lose 0 acres in developable acres. Yes. No, we've not done that yet. When we do have flow lines, typically developers will remove them if there is a flow line. Because if they're doing residential, they're going to have a basement generally. It's going to be deeper than 5 feet, so they're going to have to remove it in their construction anyway. If it's a commercial building or industrial, it might not be 5 feet deep, but we haven't had one yet that's tried to build over a flow line. I mean, other jurisdictions have, but we have not yet. At least not that we know. Say that. Yes.
To answer Sean's question earlier, if you're in the middle of a field, you have the Schonstedt turned all the way up. Generally, you can get a ping out of this. I mean, either we dig for it or we mark it and have an excavator come dig for it. But usually, if it's around 5 feet, your Schonstedt will pick it up.
Yeah, especially if you're You're trying to have no success and knowing that they could be.
Yeah, no, yeah, we use aerial imagery. And anything, aerial imagery is good. So I saw a couple of the slides mention stacks of cement. Is that like a unit of measurement that the EMCC uses?
It is a unit, yes. And if my inspector was here, she could tell us exactly what the unit of volume is. But yeah, I mean, I think originally it was a sack of dry cement, that was brought out and then mixed up. But I don't know the specific weight that's designed there. Yeah, yeah, it's a weight. I mean, it's a bag.
Yeah.
But I don't know what the volume of that is. Good question. You stumped me. 15.8. Thanks, Susan. 15.8 pounds or 15.8 cubic inches. I don't know. Okay, we'll see what she says. They did at one point, 100 years ago. Uh huh. Yeah. 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 And when I say 5 feet below the surface, that's variable, right? I mean, it might only be a foot below the surface. It could be 20 feet below the surface, right? There are some pretty deep ones. Sometimes they cut them off deep, they backfill them. Sometimes things change, soil shifts over time. Wind blows dirt in, it covers that up. Yeah, yeah. So don't assume it's only 5 feet. That's the standard of where they put it now. But if you're looking for an older one, it certainly could be deeper. Any more questions online? 94 pounds. There you go. That's 94 pounds of dry cement per sack. Yeah, Ryan? Do older wells have locations marked? Yeah, they're definitely an older well is harder to find, I think, because the original filing for where that well was not as accurate as it is today. So you've got less information on the old wells than you have in the modern wells.
And that data EC.
Yeah. Yes. Yes. Yep. Yeah, they definitely update their database, anytime something's found. Just be careful legally, because if you touch it, you probably own it. So just so you know, that's probably people don't do that. That's ECMC's regulation. They don't want the old wells touched, but if you touch it, then it becomes your responsibility. Now you could fight that legally. That's your your business with a lawyer, but that's kind of the precedent that's been set. Is that if you
Like bond against that process.
well, that was part of the financial rulemaking, the financial assurance rulemaking that happened 2 years ago with ECMC, and they're starting to do that now, right? Because operators, unfortunately, have shown over time, they spend their money up front, they drill the well, and then, they're getting a lot of production, a lot of money up front, and then it quickly declines, and it has a long, long tail. And basically, as long as they're making dollars in a month, if they're making more than its cost to run the well, in electricity or pumper visits or whatever, they're going to keep producing it, right? But at some point, it's no longer economic, right? So it's costing, they're going to shut it in. What they're supposed to do is have saved some of that money that they had at the beginning to then plug the well at the end. But historically, most operators don't. Now, the bigger operators tend to do that because they have ongoing operations in the state, right? So the big companies are actually probably better at this than the smaller companies because, for like Civitas, who's active in Aurora and other parts of Weld County. They got thousands of wells, right? Well, they can't afford to be out of compliance with the ECMC rules and regulations. And if ECMC says you've got some shut-in wells and aren't producing, you've got to plug them. Well, they're going to plug them, right? Because that's keeping their operatorship active in the state. Unfortunately, a lot of times it's the smaller operators that didn't set aside funds to plug their wells at the end. They've got a single field or a single group of wells. They all were drilled kind of the similar time frame. They start to decline at the same time, and they no longer have any income that they can pay for the plugging of the wells. So now companies are being required to put that money in up front. Before they drill the well, they have to post a bond with the state that's actually sufficient to do the work. In the past, the bond was like a statewide bond. It was like $10,000, but wells are costing $100,000, to plug and remediate or reclaim in a lot of cases.
But it seems like the ECMC database, like it really wouldn't be that much more data to give either a polygon or a plus or minus. Like, have they talked about that?
That's a really good idea. I should talk to them about that. If they had some arrow bar on there, like this is a quarter reference, or even if they had a little note, somewhere on the database record that would say something to that, agree. They do have a little bit of information on there, and you could clearly go in and see if there weren't footage references from a section line, then you would know that it's not very accurate, but that's not intuitive, right? I mean, that's something that I know because I've been working on this for years, but the average person doesn't know that. Mm-hmm.
That I've been given, like if I could go out there with a and say like, okay, well it's, I'm getting a reading from right where this is, like I have enough data to feel confident about the spot.
Right.
If the ECMC gave a single point, I mean, that would help to avoid, this, like what all were we digging up? How much money are we spending to dig this up to say, yep, I said it was there, but if someone already had done that
Right.
a few years ago, and that was a confirmed point, like that should be in the database different than if that had been done it.
I agree. Yeah, it'd be great to have some quality control, or quality reference information around those data points. Yeah. Mhm. The inspection process? No, not in Aurora. No, that's not the case in Aurora. We have a very robust process for developers. It starts with a pre-application meeting, and that's where a developer of any kind of property comes into the city. They meet with all the different departments in a single meeting, present the plans for their development, and then all the different departments get to comment on, here's what we think are the issues. You need to look at this. You need to make a change here. Be aware of this rule. Things like that. And so, yeah. Yeah. No, we provide written comments on exactly that. Right. Uh, we've not yet found any well drilled in Aurora that we didn't already know existed from the ECMC database somewhere in that section. That's not to say there aren't some. Right. Yeah. Yeah. Right. But we inspect our producing wells on a quarterly basis, and then we get out to all the other phases of operations. So drilling, construction, drilling, completions, plugging, and then if we have complaints or spills, we do those on a periodic or as needed basis. But we do all of our producing well sites and our pipeline connections on a quarterly basis. And then we're going to be initiating a annual soil survey over our plugged wells. Again, keeping in mind that for ones that are not part of a development, we can't unless the landowner allows us to go out and, find the well and do a soil survey, we can't just access private property. But for all the ones that have had development occur through them, we can go out to that park, we can do a soil survey to test and see if there's any elevation of hydrocarbons there that would be of concern. That'll be annual. Well, I wouldn't recommend that. I mean, theoretically, you could put a plug below the aquifers that would seal off the lower hydrocarbon zones, and then you'd have to perforate into the aquifers. But I wouldn't personally recommend that, because if that plug ever leaks down below, now you've got hydrocarbons in your water. So I don't know if there's any laws against that, but I wouldn't recommend it. Uh-huh.
Different scenario they have mining activity
Right?
all around us getting, and nobody ever mapped it. So they didn't know what to do. So initially, it stored natural gas,
Okay.
and then they realized the seed got it back over.
Okay.
So, question.
Yeah. Yeah. Now, in Wyoming, they drink water from the coal seams. They have wells. The water in the coal seams are fresh enough that you can actually drink it. I don't necessarily recommend that either, but they do, and they have in Wyoming. They have a lot of people have wells that are drilled into a coal seam and to produce the water. They certainly use it for agricultural purposes and livestock a lot. They use it a lot. But there are homes that have domestic wells that are drilled into coal seams. And that's also where sometimes you find where you can light the water on fire, because you're getting the methane from the coal that's coming up with the water. Ryan. So if it's in an agricultural area and there's no proposal to put a structure around it, we don't require an easement. So it's only at the point where someone comes in that wants to put a structure around a plugged well that would essentially activate the easement concept at that point. Otherwise, if it's agricultural now, and it just people want to keep it agricultural, for the future, that's fine. Nothing's being built there. We don't need an easement around that well, because it's an open field, and if it was leaking or it did blow out, we could get in there to access it to replug. So it's not a problem until somebody wants to put a structure close by, and then we want to make sure that we have the space and it doesn't get filled in such that you've got a well between two homes or something like that. Yes, yeah, and we're working on that now and writing the easement and the language to put it into city code, and we'll be requiring the easement on the site plan basically. So the site plan that's filed with the city and recorded at the county, so it's publicly available information, and it would show the easement on there to show that you can't put structures within that easement in the future. Yes, sir. So we have access. We're requiring access to it as well. Um, Generally speaking, the ones we've had so far have all been adjacent to a city street. So, for example, the park that I showed, that had city streets on three sides, houses on one side, streets on the other. So, generally speaking, on new developments, there's easy access from an existing street. But we do have it in the code that if you're going to put it like as a pocket park somewhere, you would need to have a 24-foot access for emergency vehicles. Anything else online? Go for it. I really don't. No, I mean, I understand the concept, of drilling offshore, but I've never worked offshore, thankfully. Didn't want to do that. Any other questions? Yes, sir. I think there are some state rules and regulations about how the well site is set up. The question was for those online, are there setbacks from the wellhead versus other equipment on the site? It's up to the operator to design the site however they think is best for production, for drilling and production. We try to get involved in some of the early planning. For example, we prefer, when it's possible, to have the large water tank, temporary water tank that they use to have the water for fracking on site. We prefer to have that closer to the front of the location so that if there was an incident, emergency crews could go on and access that water tank, easily without having to drive through, an area that might have an incident occurring at the time to get to a water tank at the back, for example, if they need extra water. So we do have some input on that planning part, but more or less that's a state rule that the operator they lay out the plan however they think is best to access, and then that gets filed with the state as part of their application. And then the state engineers with ECMC review that, and make comments or suggest changes or require changes. Thanks, everyone. I really appreciate your questions. Seriously, this is like probably the best audience I've ever had. Like, you got awesome questions and great. Yes, absolutely. I will send the slides out, and they'll get distributed to you at some point. So if you have any other questions, I've got business cards here, and my contact information will be in the slides as well. So please reach out at any time. We want to be an educational resource, not just in Aurora, but to the community. So if we can help you in any way, you've got further questions, follow-up questions, or you need more information, or you just want to chat about the topic, anything, give me a call. Love to chat. You're welcome.
Thank you very much.
Thanks. That was nice.
So I guess I don't know if that was the state that gave a guidance.
There's a guidance with
Uh,
allow drill pits.
Yeah.
Yeah, they had, that's when you'd have like a hill and you have to cut part of it down, and fill in the other to make it flat. There was guidance on that, on